on my drive over, the story came to mind when Thomas Jefferson first presented his credentials to the French foreign minister when he became ambassador to France. There's a story, it may be apocryphal, but the Frenchman said to him, Mr. Jefferson, you are Dr. Franklin's replacement, because Jefferson was replacing Benjamin Franklin. And he said, no, Dr. Franklin can have no replacement. I am merely his successor. So similarly, I'm sorry that you all were promised Bob Onder, and instead you get Will Scharf. I've been a fan of the Show Me Institute since long before I actually got involved in politics. I think it's really remarkable that we have a free market think tank of the quality and caliber of Show Me here in Missouri. I know that in our office we rely heavily on Show Me's work, and we're really happy that we have them as a sort of a research backstop to a lot of what we do. So it's a really important organization, and it's been an honor to be affiliated with Show Me in the past and to work with Show Me now. As you may have heard, we've had a filibuster in the Senate for the last couple days, and I thought I would start off just by explaining a little bit about what the filibuster process in the Senate looks like, why it's important, and a little bit about its history. So the filibuster this week has been over a bill, a utility regulation bill, a bill that determines the way investor-owned utilities, primarily electric utilities, can recover expenses from their customers. So why has this bogged down the Missouri legislature, the Missouri Senate, for the last 3 days? Missouri has probably the strongest legislative filibuster of any, the Missouri Senate has probably the strongest legislative filibuster of any chamber in any state in the country. There is technically a way to cut off debate in the Senate. It's called the previous question motion. It's used extremely infrequently. Last year during regular session we had a single previous question motion that was over the minimum wage preemption bill on the very last day of session when the Democrats were trying to run out the clock. We then used the PQ again during our second special session over a pro-life issue. But it is extraordinarily rare because of sort of Senate traditions. It's not used. And what that means effectively is that as long as someone is willing and able to hold the floor, they can hold up the business of the Senate. So if 3 or more senators is the usual kind of rubric from our way of thinking about it, if 3 or more senators vehemently oppose a bill, they can prevent that bill from moving through the Senate. And that's exactly what's been going on with this utility regulation bill, that effectively there were 3 senators plus a friend or 2 of theirs who really didn't like this. A great majority of the Senate was in favor of it, and they were able to shut down the business of the Senate for a while. Now, why am I sort of going through all this? Rewind 5 years, and for people who are interested in free market policy and conservatism more generally, having this strong of a filibuster was really important and really good. So the filibuster has really frustrated a lot of really important policy initiatives in the last year, whether it's on the labor front, to an extent on tort reform, although we've had a lot of successes there. It continues to be a major obstacle to meaningful education reform from a legislative perspective. More often than not, it's the rules of the Senate and I think the slow pace of legislation in general in the state of Missouri, that's sort of the key obstacle to us just kind of running the table and wiping them out. So that's my short rant on the legislative filibuster. Thank you for humoring it. Now let's talk about what's actually kind of going on in the legislature. Our number one legislative priority this year is tax reform. Last February, the governor convened his Committee for Simple, Fair, and Low Taxes. And that was chaired by our Director of Revenue, who's a guy named Joel Walters. He's a private sector guy. He spent 3.5 decades as an international tax law expert, first with a number of multinational corporations and then with PricewaterhouseCoopers. His job was scouting differential tax rates and finding favorable tax environments for companies. And we basically told him, figure out how we can make Missouri more competitive from an economic development standpoint. Growing out of that committee experience, we spent much of the summer pulling together what we hope will be the first of many tax reform packages that we move through the legislature. Our 3 goals with that package were: 1, reducing tax rates. This is something that sort of gets lost in the tax reform discussion, but where your top line tax rates are is really important. in terms of shaping people's behavior, in terms of economic development, in terms of where people decide to invest. Missouri's rates are not extraordinary, but they're higher than we'd like them to be. From a corporate standpoint and from a personal standpoint, we're kind of middle of the pack, where we want to be competitive. So that's objective number one, is get tax rates down. Objective number two was we wanted to reward hard work, and particularly for working class people who are struggling to make ends meet. Because of the regressive structure of Missouri's personal income tax, which strikes at its highest level at just $9,000 worth of income, we wanted to make sure that people at the lower end of the income spectrum were getting a disproportionate amount of the benefit of any tax package we push through. And then third, we wanted the package to be as close to revenue neutral as possible. Revenue neutrality is a controversial issue in conservative circles. But we, in light of both federal tax reform, budget challenges we've had, and just kind of the general tenor of the legislature, we wanted to actually pay for the tax cuts we were making by eliminating deductions and loopholes and kind of the special interest carveaways in the tax code. And that's exactly what our plan does. It's effectively an $800 million tax cut balanced against $800 million in eliminating loopholes primarily on the corporate side, and special deductions. And the net result of that would be a tax cut for 97.4% of Missourians, 383,000 low-income Missourians, people earning about probably between $25,000 and $50,000 a year, would see their tax liability completely eliminated. Which is significant. I mean, there are folks who might be earning $25,000 a year with two kids at home who would go from paying about $1,000 in Missouri taxes to $0 in Missouri taxes. That's real money, and that's sort of core to what our mission is. We'd cut our top line corporate tax from 6.25, which leaves us roughly middle of the pack, to 4.25, which would make us the second best state for corporate taxation of states that have a corporate income tax in the country, after North Carolina. So we really liked our package. We've been working with a number of senators and members of the House to sort of advance that legislation through. We were supposed to get a bill voted out of the Ways and Means Committee on Thursday. Because of the filibuster, that didn't happen. But we're working closely with that committee chairman, Wayne Wallingford, to get bills moving out of that committee into the Senate floor. And we have our eyes wide open about the fact that our package in intact form is likely not going to be the bill that is finally passed. But we're trying to keep as many pieces together and try to keep the package as coherent as possible. So we're really hopeful that we can get something done on taxes this year. Because it's really important. Two, we didn't do much on taxes other than some credit reform last year. And three, it's time. I mean, we have conservative supermajorities in both houses. We haven't had a tax cut since Speaker Jones pushed through SB 509 a couple years back, and that's sort of a graduated income tax rate cut, which is really, really good stuff. So we're hopeful that'll get done. I'd say after taxes, our principal priority and some of the legislation we're seeing moving through the legislature is on the subject of labor reform, which should be familiar to anyone who's sort of close with the Show Me Institute. Public sector labor reform in particular, I think Missouri is an important case for why public sector reform, particularly at the state level, is so necessary. So right now, if you look at Missouri state government, we've got about 60,000 workers. State workers, 20,000 of them are represented by a union that only 2,000 of them are actually members of. So I believe there's CWA and there's AFSCME, are the two big public sector unions that represent state workers outside of the correction system. Their dues compliance rates are minuscule. Most workers aren't members, don't pay dues, don't really care about these unions that technically represent them, and yet their labor contract, their CBA, is being negotiated by these unions. At a very basic level, that just doesn't make any sense. These workers have never voted for these unions. They've never paid dues to these unions. They have no affiliation with these unions, and yet these unions are involved in negotiating the terms that they're working under. So we think that workers should have a choice whether or not to join a union, and those choices should come in free and open elections. And if they want to be represented by a union, our state guarantees them the right to collectively bargain, and that's great. But if they don't want to be represented by a union, they shouldn't be forced to be represented by a union. I mean, I think it's sort of as free market and as as conservative as you can get at some level. The other big focus is prevailing wage reform. Are you all familiar with how prevailing wage works? Nods yes, nods no. Prevailing wage is basically an alternate minimum wage for construction projects using public money. Each job classification, carpenters, power equipment workers, laborers, etc., have a different wage that's calculated on a per county basis in this massive thing called the state wage order. It's an incredibly cumbersome system. It prices a lot of particularly non-union contractors out of a lot of jobs. And the best research we have says that eliminating prevailing wage would save between 8 and 12% on public construction projects statewide. So if you think about a small county that's building a new courthouse for $5 million, they might save $500,000, which might be the cost of 5 new police officers and a couple police cars, or however you want to cut it. It's significant money, and we've been pushing prevailing wage reform with our friends in the legislature since last year. I think this year there are a couple kind of compromise proposals short of a full repeal that actually stand a chance of making it through. The Missouri Chamber's been very involved in that. AGC, the Association of General Contractors, has been very involved in that. And actually some of the unions have come to the table with really, I think, productive, constructive steps towards a compromise. I'd single out the Carpenters Union in particular as one that's, their policy guys are really smart. And they're very aggressive and don't always agree with us, but they're good to work with, and I think we have at least a somewhat productive relationship there. I would just single them out as being reasonable and open to compromise and good to work with. So those are sort of the two big pieces on labor, public sector, and prevailing wage. Tort reform. Tort reform is one of the areas we've actually had the most success since last year. We passed a lot out of the legislature last year, changes to expert witness rules, changes to the Missouri Human Rights Act, changes to our collateral source rules. This year, the two big focuses are on venue joinder and the Missouri Merchandising Practices Act. Venue joinder, Missouri has some of the laxest venue and joinder rules in the country. So basically, where you can bring a lawsuit and who you can add to that lawsuit. So what that's resulted in, you guys may have heard about these sort of Johnson & Johnson talc cases in the city of St. Louis, but basically every plaintiff's lawyer in the country tries to file as many cases as possible in the city of St. Louis because it's a really favorable jury pool, really favorable judges. It was ranked until last year the #1 judicial hellhole in the country by the American Tort Reform Association. Thanks to our hard work last year, we've progressed from being #1 on the list of judicial hellholes to #3 on the list of judicial hellholes. So we're gonna hope to keep moving in the right direction there and one day get off that list. But venue joinder is really important. We want to make those rules tighter so that if Missourians have a valid case, they can still bring those cases. But we won't see these sort of out-of-state cases and plaintiffs' lawyers venue shopping around for the courts that they want. They should be bringing cases in courts that should have jurisdiction over the cases that they're bringing. Education reform. This is an issue that the Show Me Institute has been at the core of in Missouri for I think as long as there's been a Show Me Institute and as long as there's been an education reform movement. In terms of legislation, the three big pieces on the table are charter school reform, course access or virtual education, and then ESAs, education savings accounts, which is sort of a modern, evolved version of traditional school voucher programs. Last year, we pushed all three very aggressively. We got ESAs out of the Senate. We got a charter bill out of the House. And we were very close to having a compromise in both houses on, we got course access out of the House and almost got it done in the Senate, but we ended up losing all three of those, which was a massive disappointment for everyone who cares about this sort of thing. This year, I think we're very hopeful that we'll get a good virtual schooling bill. The bill that came out of committee isn't where we would want it to be at. It gives too much discretion, we think, to school districts and local administrators over whether students will be able to access virtual resources or not. We think that that sort of discretion should be in the hands of parents and students, not local administrators. But we're really hopeful about getting a deal done and getting a bill done there. And I think ESAs, likewise, there are some compromises to be struck on ESAs, but I think ESAs also face a pretty difficult path forward. On the administrative side, you may have seen the news. We pushed very hard for changes at the State Board of Education in the hope of being able to change our Commissioner of Education in this state. We took a lot of political heat for that. Our appointees faced threats and intimidation both to themselves, to their families, to their livelihoods. Our appointees to the State Board of Education, the likes of which we never could have imagined, and which I think would be shocking to most ordinary people. In the end, we were able to remove our Commissioner of Education, and I think that later this year we're looking to complete the search for a new Commissioner of Education. And I think being able to drive reform at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education is absolutely vital from an education reform perspective. There's a story, actually Speaker Jones could probably speak to this better than I can, but there's a story a couple of years back. There was a bill that was moving through the House for A through F report cards for every school. DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, would literally just take the data they already have and they're already compiling and rank schools A through F based on that data. And I think they left on a Thursday and they thought they had 130 votes for that bill. Members got back in their districts. The education establishment mobilized against this bill because actually telling parents whether their kids are going to good schools or bad schools would be an existential threat to the education establishment, apparently. And when they all got back on Monday evening, they were down to like 60 votes. Is that roughly correct? So that's the level of organization of the opposition that we're facing. And it's been immensely frustrating, but we're hopeful that we'll be able to continue making progress and build success on success. One last thing I would just note, which has been a big focus of ours, it's a little bit outside of the catchment of the Show Me Institute and kind of free market economics and free market policy. But a major focus of our administration has been around the issue of foster care, foster care and adoption. Particular interest of the First Ladies, who's been a real leader on this. We have about 20 bills moving through special committees in the House and Senate around the issue of foster reform. There are 13,000 kids that move in and out of Missouri's foster care system every year. Our foster care system doesn't do a particularly good job of caring for them, and outcomes there aren't really the best. And we're looking to really do something good for them. And we view this as kind of a non-political issue, as something that we hope everyone's able to get around. And we've seen a lot of success there. I think we got some good bills passed last year, and I think we're hopeful that we'll get some more good bills passed this year. I've kind of just talked at y'all for a very long time, and I apologize for that. I'm also very cognizant of the fact that I'm mic'd and on the record, which makes me very nervous because I like to sort of operate in the shadows. But happy to take any questions y'all have. I don't view it as being a simple choice between K through 12 and higher ed, and that's not sort of the way we think about the budget. If you think about general revenue as being about $9.5 billion, by the time you get through with K through 12 at almost any funding level, because even if you move that slider back a little bit or move it up, by the time you get through K through 12, Medicaid, TANF, SNAP, and sort of the other social programs that we can't really get away from, and maybe corrections. You've already eaten corrections and public safety. Corrections and public safety is about $800 million. Your K through 12 plus welfare pieces are going to be about $6.5 billion combined. So once you're through the two of those, the amount of discretionary general revenue you have left for like higher ed and everything else ends up being a relatively small pool. What we saw in last year's budget and what we're continuing to see this year and going forward is every single healthcare line in the budget, whether we're talking about Medicaid, Medicaid pharmacy, or like actual state employee healthcare, healthcare for prisoners, which is actually probably the best of all of these. Every single healthcare line in the budget is going crazy. So we start in the hole several hundred million dollars every year just to keep up with mandatory increases in the cost of healthcare that we have to pay. Higher ed took some cuts last year. It's taken some cuts this year. But we think there's a lot of room to cut administrative waste in higher ed. The University of Missouri started taking at our direction, started taking a really hard look at administrative practices and looking for administrative savings this year. And they've identified between 60 and 70 million in administrative overhead they think they can cut without touching the student experience. I think some of our higher ed institutions have done a pretty good job along those lines. Others really haven't. The amount of the total higher ed spending in this state that comes from state general revenue is relatively small. This is, how many of y'all are business people? So if you really had to, do you think you could cut 2% out of your business's budget without like materially impacting operations? Yes, no, maybe? So that's, with most institutions, that's what we're looking at, 1.5, 2%. And we're asking them to dig deep and find some savings because we're doing that in the rest of government. And we've seen some resistance to that. Other leaders in higher ed, I think, really get it. Mun Choi, our new president at Mizzou, or at the University of Missouri system, has been great about identifying savings, really trying to think hard about whether you need different print shops in different departments. We did a kind of, we looked at like the overall organizational charts of the University of Missouri and found that a huge percentage of supervisors were supervising a single person. So you had all kinds of like weird personnel practices stacked up and frankly unnecessary administrative personnel. I think the University of Missouri by one metric is like #2 in the country for administrators per student capita. So we think there is room to cut. We don't like relish taking money out of higher ed because ultimately investing in higher ed is, it's good for workforce development, good for the economy. It's important to keep college affordable for Missouri students. Like we believe in all of that, but we think there is room to cut there without harming the product we're putting out. And I think looking longer term, we want to shift to a real a differential funding model based on performance. Right now, when we cut higher ed, it basically every school takes an equivalent hit, which is silly because some schools are doing a really good job and probably don't deserve to take any cut to their budgets, and other schools are doing a terrible job, and we probably shouldn't be funding them at the level that they are. But the budget process in Missouri has traditionally viewed them all as equals, in part because of regional politics, and in part because there just hasn't been an impetus to take this on previously. That was a very long-winded answer to a very simple question. I think what I would say is that the higher ed cuts are not, we don't view them as being a huge threat to higher ed in Missouri unless higher ed in Missouri is unwilling to dig deep and look for ways to save money the way the rest of state government is. On your second question about utility rate making and this being terrible timing for a major utility bill in light of the fact that the federal government just cut corporate tax rates, which is going to dramatically impact sort of revenue requirement and the utilities required, or their need for rate base going forward. I think that's right. One of the things this bill does is for everyone not, the bill that passed out of the Senate last night, for everyone who's not presently in the middle of a rate case, this makes sort of the PSC true them up and adjust their rates to reflect the new federal tax bill. So for, let's say, Ameren, which likely won't go in for a rate case for a couple of years, customers as a result of this bill will see a reduction in their energy rates 2 years before they would otherwise. I think could the timing be better? I mean, I think with any of the things we're looking at, whether it's tax reform, anything that really touches the economy, the effects of the federal tax plan are profound, and we likely don't fully understand the second and third order effects of that plan. So I think you could make the argument that it's a bad time to be doing a lot of the things that we're doing, not just sort of utility rate making, but I think it's an important bill. I think subject to our review and making sure we fully understand it. There are parts of it that I don't like, but on the balance, I think it was an important step. Yes, state workers can opt out of paying dues to those unions, but they're still represented by those unions in contract negotiations. So to me, that just doesn't make any sense. That these workers are not affiliated with unions. They're not, as you said, they're able to opt out of paying dues to them, but they're still operating under a collective bargaining agreement that's negotiated with that union at the table. So that just doesn't make much sense to me. I think in general there's an argument that not allowing the market to set wages leads to increased costs. I think particularly with the way we do prevailing wage in Missouri, it's based on the submission of wage sheets by contractors on a county-by-county basis. So in a lot of smaller counties, particularly rural counties in sort of deep northern and deep southern Missouri, you don't have enough jobs, so people aren't submitting wages on any kind of a regular basis. And because of the way we do prevailing wage, what ends up happening is the prevailing wage in those counties reverts to the prevailing wage in often just the nearest big city. So you'll see in some parts of northeastern Missouri, the prevailing wage is effectively a St. Louis wage. So you might see, let's say a carpenter getting the equivalent of 50 or 60 bucks an hour based on prevailing wage, when none of the local carpenters would make that on a normal job site, and that's just not where the local labor market is. So you could, you're effectively pricing out local contractors. Sure, but labor costs on that project might end up being, twice what they would be otherwise. So from the perspective of the municipality or the municipality or county or whoever who's bidding out the job, if they're paying 50 bucks an hour instead of what they would be paying local skilled carpenters, let's say 30 bucks an hour, that's a huge increase in their cost base. So it's costing them more money. So Ohio put in a moratorium on prevailing wages over school construction a couple years back. So we have pretty good kind of comparative pricing data from there in terms of what the impact of a prevailing wage repeal is, because it's literally just the same project year on year, moratorium or not moratorium. And the data from there shows about a 12% reduction in overall construction costs. If you think of most construction jobs, labor is going to be about a third of your cost base. So prevailing wage results in eliminating prevailing wage, particularly on rural jobs, is going to save you about a third of your labor component of your cost base there. But prevailing wage doesn't touch private sector stuff. And then in terms of tax offsets, I'll give you just a couple examples. One, we're the only state in the country that currently gives corporations 3 different choices about how they want to apportion their income. So if you think about multi-state corporations, any corporation that's basically operating in multiple states, they don't pay taxes on 100% of their income in any state, because that would be unfair. So instead, there are different apportionment methods for how you kind of chop up your income among the different states you're operating in. Missouri basically tells corporations now, you can take your pick of 3 wildly disparate apportionment methods, pick whichever's lowest, and pay taxes under that method. No other state in the country does it that way, and it leads to all kinds of terrible second-order effects. Iowa's corporate income tax rate is currently significantly higher than ours. I think they're at 10%, we're at 6.25%. If you're a multi-state corporation doing business in just Iowa and Missouri, I'm using that as an example just because it's simple, you actually pay less in taxes if you invest capital and hire people in Iowa than you would if you were to do the same in Missouri. So we're incentivizing companies to not invest and not hire people in the state of Missouri based on because we allow multiple apportionment methods. I can get a little more into it's a 3-factor. Right now we have a 3-factor apportionment method, a single sales factor apportionment method, and a modified single sales factor apportionment method. We want to switch Missouri to being single sales factor only. We believe that would generate about $140 million in additional revenue for the state every year, and would also incentivize corporations to invest in Missouri and hire in Missouri instead of investing and hiring in other states, which we also think would be good. Another example is the timely filing sales tax discount. Right now, if you're a corporation or if you're any business that collects sales tax, if you file your taxes on time, you get 2% of your tax back. This is a throwback to the days when like a supermarket had to have a little bookkeeper in the back keeping the books, and it was really difficult to pay your taxes on time. Now most of that's just automated. We're the only state in the country to have an uncapped timely filing discount as high as ours is. Most states say that we'll give you a timely filing discount up to, say, $10,000 a year. But basically what we're doing is, like, think of like a big box retailer like Walmart. We're taking all of the sales tax we're getting from Walmart and just paying them 2% back of it every year. And again, we're the only state in the country that does things that way. So the timely filing discount's another area where we're bringing back some revenue in our plan. Federal income tax deductibility. Missouri is an outlier in terms of the extent to which it allows federal income taxes to be deductible both for corporations and for individuals. We're eliminating, or we want to eliminate federal income tax deductibility for corporations. For individuals, we want to phase it out. So the way we do the FIT deduction in Missouri is really favorable for lower and middle income Missourians. We don't want to we don't want to harm lower and middle income Missourians, but for higher earners who are getting a big tax cut anyway, we phase out the deduction over time to bring some income back on the positive side. Again, under our plan, 97.4% of Missourians, I think that's the most recent number, would see a tax cut. So phasing out the FIT doesn't bring too many people into the red. But that's another way that we're bringing in revenue. The last piece I think would be the streamlined sales tax, which is a way of allowing remote sellers, people who are outside the state of Missouri but selling into the state of Missouri, to more easily remit sales taxes, sales and use taxes, which we think would bring in some revenue as well. Are you all familiar with MTC? MTC was sort of conceived as a state-backed like venture capital fund that would fund startups in Missouri that would help sort of cultivate entrepreneurship and innovation. Are you involved with MTC, sir? MTC we think it's not particularly well run or well conceived in its current form. You basically have political people trying to pick and choose among companies that oftentimes either don't need the capital or shouldn't be getting the capital. MTC's returns have not been particularly good. What we want to do is turn MTC into, if it's going to exist, and from a pure free market perspective, it's picking winners and losers and government getting involved in the private sector, and I don't love that, again, speaking for me personally, but if we're going to have an MTC, we want it to be run in a more business-like way, again, with sort of incentives in the right place. So what we proposed last year was taking MTC's existing funding stream, which is about between $10 and $25 million a year, bonding on the basis of that, getting a big upfront investment pool, and then hiring private sector advisors to run it. So basically to create an actual state venture capital fund that would operate like a normal venture capital fund instead of like this weird kind of quasi-governmental entity that dribbles out money every year kind of at random. I hope that's I'm not trying to disparage MTC. I think it's done some valuable work. I just think that its management isn't properly geared to the task that it's been given. We're continuing to look at options with MTC. I think there are real challenges there, but I think that we believe that MTC needs to be reformed. I think some in the legislature do as well. And it's something we're going to continue working on. Yeah, look, it was really aggressive. I mean, Senate leadership made it very clear that they weren't leaving until this bill was done, which normally you get to Thursday and senators have lives and jobs back home in their districts. We have a part-time legislature, and they're itching to go. So I was really excited to see both the Senate leadership giving this bill a lot of floor time early on, even before this week, and then really pressing the issue this week. So yeah, I'm hopeful. I'd love to see the Senate do this every week. Pick a controversial issue pass out the bills they have to pass out early in the week, and then give a controversial issue some floor time and see, either if you can break down the opposition to it or negotiate a solution. I will say there are some things in this bill that passed out yesterday. We're in the very early stages of our bill review, but there's like $70 million in subsidies for solar energy, which ultimately are paid by the ratepayers, are paid by all of us in our monthly electric bills, and I don't love that. That's the sort of the practical effect of the filibuster, the way we have the filibuster in this state. Even when it's not stopping legislation, you see a lot of legislation, kind of dirtied up and leaving the legislature in sort of a very non-clean form because of filibuster tactics. Well, so look, my family's comes from Florida. I'm not a Missouri native. I think statewide in Florida we have maybe 56 or 58 school districts. So we're looking at like an order of magnitude difference between Florida and Missouri, which just I'm not here to pitch consolidation. I'm not here to say that that's a problem, but it is a feature of education in Missouri. That we have a lot of districts, and that districts have strong political, school districts have strong political constituencies in their local areas. I believe firmly in local control, but I think more important is parental control. I think parents should have the right to dictate, how their children are educated. In an ideal world, yes. I think there are some characteristics of our system that frustrate that that sort of democratic impulse. I'd say, we have school board elections in off cycle. That they're in April, voter turnout's very low. And what that usually leads to is, the constituencies that have a vested interest in protecting the current system get their people out and they vote. And it's a concentrated benefit versus diffuse cost issue. I also think that every child is different, and in a lot of cases you'll see kind of what's good for the district played off against what's good for the individual child. I think virtual schooling is a great example of that. Show Me's done great work on the issue of course access, and how many districts in Missouri don't offer chemistry, don't offer physics, don't offer advanced math classes in high school. If you're a really smart kid in a rural sub 100 enrollment district in Missouri, and you can't take physics or calculus because your school doesn't offer physics and calculus, I think you should be able to take that kid should have his district pay for him to take that course virtually, or at least he shouldn't be prevented from taking that course virtually. Instead, what you often hear from school administrators is, well, if we have to cater to every whim of these kids, and if we have to provide those sorts of options, that's going to hurt the district, and that comes out of my bottom line, and that means I can't do X, Y, and Z with my money. And to me, that's a very unfortunate attitude. To answer your question directly in terms of, shouldn't parents have that choice? I think, or shouldn't, the democratic process kind of work that out? I think in an ideal world, that is how things would work. But I think that requires that the voters have accurate, good information about the performance of their district so that they can make an informed decision. And what we've seen from the education establishment in the last year is basically an active effort to frustrate any attempt at making it clear to parents how their schools are actually doing. There's one big district administrator I won't say his name, I won't say the district, but he's been one of our kind of harshest opponents on this whole raft of issues. His total compensation package is about $400,000 a year, and his district performance has declined every single year since he came into office. His school board consistently re-ups his contract, consistently votes him more money in retention bonuses, more money in base salary, more perks in terms of country club memberships, car allowances, etc. And I can't believe they would do that if they truly understood the performance of that school district. his performance as superintendent. So I think there are informational asymmetries present when you start talking about school politics that have led to unfortunate results. But yeah, I think, you know, government that governs best governs least. You know, you sort of get into Tocqueville and the idea of kind of local communities being best able to govern themselves. Philosophically, 100% there with you. But I just think in order for that to be possible, there are some, you know, preliminary steps that you need to hit first. You know, you can overdo things in either direction. I actually had a huge fight with 2 lobbyists last week on a tort reform bill that I thought unfairly denied people access to the courts. I think you need a court system that allows for, ultimately, for fair judgments, that properly aligns incentives and properly assigns risk and assigns loss. I think that where the tort system can go off the deep end is when unfair judgments, and I'm speaking sort of in like ideal forms here, we could argue about what constitutes an unfair judgment, but where unfair judgments become the norm and where you set up incentives for people to pursue lawsuits against companies that aren't meritorious, that aren't based on actual real felt harm, I mean, you're using an instrumentality of government to screw the free market. So from a free market economics perspective, I think there's a need to align your tort system, and this gets into sort of like Epstein and Posner and whatever else, but there's a need to align your tort system like with actual risk, with actual damage, and with actual incentives. So at a very high level, that's how I would answer that question. I mean, we can argue about specific measures and that kind of thing all day long. I think Missouri was such a notable outlier, particularly in terms of the Missouri Human Rights Act and the Missouri Merchandising Practices Act, in terms of how we process sort of human rights-oriented cases and then consumer protection cases, that it's been a huge impediment to economic growth and economic development in the state. So I think that's kind of a more grounded policy argument. But yeah, from a philosophical perspective, I think it's just a question of properly aligning your tort system.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Brenda.